Hello, and welcome to Eppendorf Lab Channel. My name is Matthew Yurkevich. I'm a marketing manager here at Eppendorf in Hamburg, Germany. This is the world premiere of our brand new space dedicated to bringing you experts and knowledge live. This includes webinars, demos, applications, and interactions with your fellow scientists. Without further ado, I want to introduce today's topic, digitalization. We're going to be welcoming an expert from the UK, Steve Day. He's the head of regional segment marketing for Eppendorf Europe. He's been with Eppendorf for over 17 years with a background in life science and digitalization. Steve is going to provide his valuable insight and perspective on digitalization, how and why to enter the digital laboratory. Steve, good morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, Matthew. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful, and I'm really glad you're here with us today. I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with us about digitalization. I'd like everyone in the stream, though, to take a moment to look down below the video and at the 2 poll questions we posted. We appreciate your input and responses because this will help us tailor these presentations and the content we're delivering to meet your needs. At the same time, you're going to see a chat window over to the right. You can use that chat window for any of your questions, your comments, your reactions, anything like that, and we have an application specialist in the room as well looking to help. After the presentation, Steve and I are going to be available for questions, and as well as follow-ups for anyone who is interested. With that said, Steve, I'm going to let you take control.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matthew. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the concept of a digital laboratory, the benefits you can gain, and some of the considerations you might have before you begin your digital journey. So I'd like to begin with some definitions. Digitization versus digitalization. What is meant by these 2 different words? Well, digitization is the transformation of analog data into digital. There will be digitized data in your lab already. Maybe it's digital photographs or Excel sheets, but this is not the same as digitalization. Digitalization is the transformation by which processes change, new working models emerge and are created by using digital data sources and tools connected together to give you efficiencies and insights. You will have many digital data sources in your life, but how are they connected? And when we talk about digitalization today, we're going to be talking, of course, about the digitized data sources, analog data sources we need to digitize, and the current sources you already have. We're going to talk about the interconnectivity between these data sources. We're going to touch on cloud computing and, of course, cloud storage, and the Internet of Things, connecting physical devices to the Internet. Now, we've all heard these terms, the Internet of Things, cloud computing. So you're aware that they're in the world. You may ask the question, is this accessible for my lab today? Or is this something that is yet to become easy to implement and easy to access for my laboratory? Well, before we look at the professional world and your lab, let's contrast this with your personal digital journey. I would imagine many of you are using cloud solutions. Now, this could be a streaming service where you stream media directly from cloud providers. It may be that you use cloud drives to back up your devices or as a way of sharing information with friends and family. If you have a smartphone, you almost certainly have a digital assistant. Now, that digital assistant uses cloud computing. This is why if you ask a question to Siri, it doesn't work when you don't have data. Now, in this case, you're using a computer that isn't local to conduct a process and then relay the result to your phone. You're using cloud computing. When we look at connected devices, of course, we talked about one of the most connected devices, your smartphone. But there are many other connected devices you could have, or most likely do have in your home. These could be game systems, TVs, but it could be digital assistants at home. For example, an Amazon Alexa or Amazon Echo or a Google Home. These devices could be connected to lights, your heating, security systems. Connections existing, streaming data from physical devices and other data sources to you, giving you access to tools and insights, potentially whilst you're not in the home. There are lots of reasons why you jumped into the digital world in your personal life. It gives you access to information on the move. It allows you to speed up processes. You can do your banking whilst you're on the train on the way to work. It allows you to easily share information or services with your family. It allows you to protect your data. You don't have to worry about losing your phone. You're backed up to the cloud. Another benefit is if you use cloud services, often you pay with a subscription or pay as you use it, which means the entry cost is significantly lower for using a lot of these services. You can broadly break down these different benefits into three groups. There's a time and money saving. And this is closely linked to, of course, convenience, able to do things easily and simply. And finally, there's safety. Now, that could be safety for yourself, not having to go somewhere with home security, but also very much safety for your data. You're able to protect your data and your memories and your photos in the cloud. So your personal journey is quite well developed. What I'd like to do now is look at some of the challenges you may see in your laboratory, in your professional life, and then ask the questions how we could resolve that with a digital solution. Well, first of all, everyone needs to improve efficiencies, and within the lab, there is no different. How can we do more with the same resources? Planning and documenting experiments are a central part of science, but there's a time associated with this. And as it becomes more and more important to fully document and have a fully traceable experiment, the time required to plan and document experiments becomes more. If you're in some form of compliant laboratory, where maybe you have internal compliance or potentially external compliance requirements, how can you pull together the documentation you need when it comes time to audit? Is it an easy process? Or is this something that involves a lot of time, each time you're required to provide auditable material? Every time we ask customers about the challenges or the needs within the laboratories, the need to improve sample safety is always in the top three. Your samples are the most invaluable and the most key things within the laboratory. Improving sample safety is always a goal. Linked to this is, of course, knowing where your samples are. Do you know where all the samples are in your freezer? What is at the back? Of course, being able to easily and quickly locate samples allows you to safeguard them by being able to easily access them. It also allows you to trace them. So if you had to prove where a sample was, you could easily do this. Can you do that right now? Variability between experiments. Now, that could be you as an individual doing the same experiment time and time again. How do you make sure you do it the same way each time? Or maybe if you're operating to a standard operating procedure and you have different individuals working, how do you minimize the variability between individuals for the same experiment? Having equipment breakdowns in your laboratory can massively impact your output. So minimizing equipment downtime is a key challenge in all lab settings, as it can really have an effect on the science and how much you can get done in a day. And part of this process is managing this equipment. If you have a large lab, how do you stay on top of all the different scheduled maintenance tasks that you need to do for each device? It could be you're in a shared lab space and different individuals have responsibilities for different devices. How do you make sure they're aware that they're reminded of this and that you can check it's been done easily and simply? And of course, this all links to reducing costs. The better maintained your equipment is, the longer it can last. So how can you reduce costs relating to your equipment within the laboratory? Now, this is something I think we can all relate to, especially over the last 18 months to 2 years. When you have reduced access to the lab, how do you get access to your information? It may be that you can only have a certain number of people in the lab. It may be that you're not allowed to travel. How do you get access to information, and how do you know that your samples or your experiment is running correctly when you don't have access to the lab? Key to science has always been the ability to share information. How easy is it to share protocols and results quickly, easily, and traceably within your laboratory? And finally, data security. Now, you may think of data security associated with the cloud and digital sources, but I really want to expand that. I think data security needs to be seen relative to analog and physical data sources. If you have a lab book and it gets wet, is that still data that you have access to? How are your physical data sources secured? How is the traceability? How do you check who's accessing them? I mean, even as simple as, can you read the handwriting of the person that used that lab book before you? How easy is it to search? All of these things impact the data integrity and therefore the data security of your lab's data. So how can you improve data security? Now, I hope you can relate to some of these challenges and pain points in your lab. I mean, and again, we can broadly break these down into the three areas that we saw before: time and money saving, convenience, and safety. Now, be that safety for yourself by not having to have access to the lab, or maybe more common, safety for your samples. What I'd like to do to make it a little bit more relative to the lab as opposed to your personal life is really break that into 4 groups. So my first one is experiment management, so process management. Then we have asset management. How do we manage the devices? Compliance and documentation. So how do you maintain a compliant environment, and how do you manage the documentation required in your laboratory? And of course, the final topic, sample safety. How can we improve sample safety? So we asked the question, can digitalization help solve these problems? Well, I would very much propose the answer is yes. And I'm guessing as you're here on this webinar, you also believe digitalization can support you in your lab. And I don't think that digitalization is a new concept. As we've seen in your personal life, it's something that's already there. So before we look at how a connected lab could appear or how it could look, let's consider where we are now. So we asked the question of our customers, how digital is your lab? We asked the question around manual data tracking processes. Now in this, we had things like lab books, a sample sheet, potentially it could be an Excel sheet, whilst digital not connected to anything per se. 86% of our respondents from the academic sector are still using manual data tracking processes. And 65% of biotech customers are still using manual data tracking processes. What this says to me and makes clear is that many labs are at the start of their digital journey. There's still a lot of space to grow into this digitalization world. If we look at the other end and we consider connected laboratories, laboratories where devices are connected to a central platform, streaming information with alerts, data collected for compliance requirements. When we ask this question, only 5% of our biotech customers have some form of connected laboratory. So again, this really shows that there's a lot of opportunity to move into digitalization and solve some of those challenges that we saw in the previous slides. So now what I'd like to do is consider how a connected laboratory could look. And to do this, what I'd like to do is to look at a basic workflow. Now the workflow I've selected is an RNA prep, but it could be anything because it's a very generic process. So we receive samples. We go through an RNA extraction and cleanup. We'll then go through an analysis step. Of course, we have to document our results, and then we want to store the RNA for downstream applications. So if we break the experiment management into two groups, one is planning, executing, and documenting the experiment, and the other is tracking the samples, which of course is key within the process management as well as inventory management. Then we want to look at maintenance management. How do we manage the assets? How do we make sure the devices are kept working and in optimal condition? If you're in a compliant environment, how do we track all this? How do we create compliance documentation for an audit throughout this process? And of course, how do we manage and maintain the safety of our samples? How do we make sure the sample is kept intact, uncontaminated, and safe throughout the process? So if we have a look at some of the analog steps as we come into this, and some of the challenges around that, and then consider the digital solutions which could help to solve these problems. Well, your samples come into the lab. You have the sample information. Now, this may be in an electronic format. It may be on paper. You have self-labeled tubes. So this could be handwritten directly on the tube. It could be written on a label that then has to be applied to the tube. This creates variability between samples. It creates variability between users. And there's a time involved with actually having to label the tubes. As the samples come in, of course, you have to note this process. So this has to be managed in the lab notebook. So we have an RNA extraction and cleanup. We have a protocol. Now, you may write that protocol out yourself to follow, or you may use the protocol from the supplier of the kit. But this is still something you have to follow. It's something separate. You have maybe the lot number and any documents like NSDSs you may want to save and associate with this protocol or with this specific experiment. How do you do that when you have a physical number or a physical document or just files? Of course, the process needs to be documented in a lab notebook. Again, this is a process. It takes time to write down each time. And you have, again, self-labeled tubes. At this stage, you may be transferring from the tubes you received into tubes that you want to process your samples in. So there's an opportunity there to mix up samples or to mislabel, and of course, the time associated with labeling samples. We have our analysis step. When you present samples, it may be, if you're going to a spec, that you have the information in a spreadsheet. Again, you have the self-labeled tubes that you need to manage. And of course, you need to document the process in your lab notebook. Then you get your results. You use the spectrophotometer, or if you use any other device, you will get a result after analysis. This has to be printed out or has to be saved and stored and associated with this experiment. And of course, this process again has to be noted in the lab notebook. Finally, we have storage. The lab notebook is here again. We have to track the process. Once it's in the freezer, we use a storage spreadsheet, or maybe it's a notebook, somewhere noting where that sample is. How secure is an Excel spreadsheet if it's accessible by lots of people? How do you know when it's been changed? How do you make sure things have been updated properly? It may be that you want to have the actual storage data, what temperature your samples were stored at, recorded. This could be for a compliance process. It could be to look back at a sample over time and check how it has been stored. It could be simply to see how often the door has been left open in the freezer. This information, if you have a newer freezer, you'll be able to export that on a USB stick, or perhaps with a slightly older model, you'll actually have a chart recorder, in which case you then have a paper record. Then we come to sample safety in its most obvious way. If there's a freezer failure, how do you know? Well, you might have a building management system or an auto dialer that contacts you directly, gives you a call and tells you that there is a problem. But how do you know what the problem was? How do you know what the problem is at the time? How do you know who responded to it and how quickly? And how is this recorded? All of these feature into a compliance process. How do you record what's going on throughout the process? How could you go back to this experiment and show what had happened at each stage, be it a freezer error or which samples went where or the lot number? How do you record all this information for a compliance process? And how do you make sure all the devices are kept at top specification? Well, the first thing we can do is look at an electronic lab notebook or a guided protocol tool. Now, this is an electronic notepad, but it has timestamp and user stamps. It's cloud enabled. It's designed to allow collaborations. It's centrally stored, which means you'll never lose data. You can see who's accessed it, and multiple collaborators can contribute to the same piece of work or to the same database of information. A guided protocol tool allows you to design a protocol beforehand, and then it'll take you step by step through the protocol. Each time you complete a step, it records that step is completed, and at the end stores the results. This allows you to create a documented process and minimize variability between users or between experiments. Now you can see all the steps here that this can support. Everywhere there's a lab notebook, you're automatically recording with a guided protocol tool, or when you're recording it in a lab notebook, it's there, date stamped and time stamped with a secure digital record of your work. Your protocols or documentation can all be stored alongside this specific experiment. Any spreadsheets or additional information can be stored directly alongside this experiment, so you can come back to it and find these things easily. And of course, this is supporting your compliance process. And it's date stamped and user stamped. You can use this to underpin compliance. Within your process, to take it to the next level, to be able to show where a sample is, you want to track your samples through the process and into storage. Now, the easy way to do this is to move from a labeled tube to a barcoded tube. This is digitizing your samples. Now, to barcode a tube, you can, of course, print off a label and stick it on, or buy pre-barcoded tubes. Either which way, you reduce the risk of mislabeling and reading that label each time. And if you buy pre-barcoded tubes, the time involved with labeling. Inventory management or sample tracking means that you can track your sample through the process and show at each stage where a sample is in the process relative to your experiment. And at the end, it allows you to easily check where you've stored your sample. So the risk of losing samples is hugely reduced, and you can maximize your freezer space. So you can see here all the places that are impacted by having barcoded tubes and inventory management. And of course, again, this is helping you underpin your compliance processes should you need. The next element to consider is maintenance management, how you manage your maintenance and device booking. Now, if you're in a large lab and you have multiple devices, how do you make sure that all those devices are being managed? Well, a device management system will allow you to set schedules per device. It will allow you to allocate tasks to individuals, and when those tasks are completed and they check them off, that is recorded. This allows you to create an easily trackable process around all your devices, being able to see when and where they've been serviced or maintained. Device booking allows you to book devices in your workflow. In a busy lab, you may have shared devices. This allows you to be more efficient when you're looking to do your work, speeding up processes and making sure that you get your work done quickly. Connected devices can even give you indications of a device's health and maybe alert you to problems before there's a breakdown. Again, reducing the risk of unplanned downtime. This massively supports, of course, your device management process and also your compliance processes. Document management and storage. So when you do a calibration of a device, or you have an SOP that you want stored, having a document management system either associated with the device or with the process allows you to store those documents directly with those assets or processes, making it easy to find and easy to trace. And finally, we have device monitoring and notification. This is where devices in your lab are directly connected to a digital platform, be it locally or in the cloud. This allows you to take information directly from devices. It could be results or it could be run data. It gives you an insight to how a device is running. It allows you to plan your work. It keeps you appraised of any problems there might be with the device. So you can see if you had a printout, you could easily associate that from your device directly with your experiment. If you have a compliance process where you need to collect data on how a device is run, then this happens automatically. This data is streamed to the digital platform, making it very simple to work. And of course, if there is an issue, then you're notified. Who answers it and how long it took is also recorded. So again, this underpins your compliance processes so you can actually see what happened and when it happened within the process into your samples. So what I hope I've been able to do is give you an overview of how the different digital tools that currently exist could simply be implemented today in your lab and how they can create efficiencies and reduce risk for your processes and samples. So now we've looked at this, the question is, how do we start this process? What are your first steps into the digital laboratory if you haven't already taken them? Where could you start your digitization journey? Well, I think there's a couple of places that you can begin this. The first question could be, what is your biggest challenge? Where would the biggest impact be? What problem could you solve that would really improve the workflow in your laboratory? Or maybe it's a different approach. What's the easiest change to implement? What could you do today with minimal work, but it puts you on your digital journey? Now, with that in mind, do you have a digital roadmap? What are the stages that you want to consider? Where do you want to be today? Where do you want to be tomorrow? And where will you be in 3 years? This process isn't binary. It's not one or the other. This is a journey. You can do it stage by stage, but it's important to understand what your roadmap looks like and how that could all fit together. So if we look at what needs to be considered, the first thing, of course, is the solution. So you have to ask the question, do you want to look at a cloud-based solution with its flexibility and future-proof versus a more controlled local solution? You want to consider the ease of installation. How easy is this to implement within your laboratory? How easy is it to use? How intuitive is it as a piece of software or as a solution? And how scalable is it? Is this something that works for a small lab for 1 or 2 devices? Or is this something that can be built and over time increase in size and support multiple users and multiple devices? Interconnectivity. How does it connect? How easy is it to connect the data you get here to other data sources? When you consider future connections, what's the plan for connecting other data sources in the future? And how flexible is this as a solution? You have to consider your infrastructure. I mean, it's a digital environment. So of course you do have to consider things like your network capacity, be this Wi-Fi or be this LAN ports and access. You have to consider your IT infrastructure and the IT support that you could receive, not just the support in implementation, but the support in planning, and potentially how much you need to secure from IT initially to actually have them support the process to allow you to implement a connected laboratory. If you're considering digital lab books or potentially guided protocols, then this needs a personal device. Do you want individuals using their own personal devices, phones and tablets, or is that something the institute will provide? So these are questions to ask at this stage. The next step to consider, of course, is people. Any change to any process in any environment, be it laboratory or any organization, it requires a process of change management where you take people through a process, explain to them the benefits, show them the benefits, communicate with them, highlight the quick wins, and really work to establish this within your laboratory. And as part of that change management process, you have to identify, does everyone have the right skills and the right support to really utilize and maximize these new systems you're putting in place? Finally, you need to consider support. If this is a new process for you, you need to consider what kind of support you get during the planning process. What consultative advice do you get from whichever partner you choose to work with? Whilst you're going through the setup, is this something you do yourself or something where you get support, where they help you implement these tools and platforms within your lab? And then ongoing, your solution shouldn't just be for today or for tomorrow. You should be looking at a solution that is scalable and will grow with you. Will they be able to support you in 5 years' time? It makes sense to select providers who are established, who have some longevity, so you can make sure they'll be here when you need support, when you expand in 2 or 3 years. So what I hope I've been able to show you is how you can build efficiencies into the processes of planning and documenting your processes and experiments, how you can build efficiencies into the process of managing your lab devices, the maintenance tasks, and how to reduce the risk of unplanned downtime. How throughout all of these processes, you can simply collect and build the documentation for your compliance needs and audits. And finally, how you can reduce the risks to your samples by effectively tracking and monitoring them from anywhere at any time. I'd like to bring that back to those 3 earlier considerations when we talked about your personal life. The digital transformation you've done in your personal life is based around saving time and money, convenience and safety, and it's exactly the same in the lab. So now you've heard about the potential future digital lab. We'd love you to start your digital journey with Eppendorf. We have a range of products from eLab Next, including eLab Inventory, which is our sample management software, allowing you to effectively track samples. This is combined with eLab Journal, which is an electronic lab notebook, which allows you to track the processes and your samples, giving you a documented record of how an experiment has run. This is combined with our Visionized Lab Suite. This offers a platform for managing your devices through their maintenance schedules. It offers device monitoring and alerts, so you can easily build compliance documentation. You can easily check on your runs. You can check on the performance of your machines. And if there is an issue or you need to know about the end of a run, you can be alerted. It's soon to include experiment planning, execution, and documentation of processes, allowing you to minimize the risk of variability between experiment to experiment. And all of these build into a simple tool for exporting data into a compliance program. So you can easily provide documentation for your compliance systems. So if you'd like to find out more, please contact us and we'd be happy to discover your digital journey with you. I hope you found that insightful, and I hope it raised a few questions for you about your lab in the future, and we would be happy to take questions now. Thank you. Can't quite hear you, Matt.
Sorry, Steve. Sorry, Steve. That was great. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Very informative, and we learned a lot about our digital future. And we have a couple questions they actually would like to ask you. And the first one would be, where do you see the biggest obstacles for introducing a new digital system in the laboratory?
So there is always challenges with putting new tools in, and there's always technical elements to it. But in my experience, watching implementation of digital systems or any system in any organization, it is the process of making sure that people are comfortable. It's the change management process. It's really making sure that individuals understand why you're doing things, the value to them, the value to your organization, and really helping them through that process of adopting and cementing these new processes into their daily life. Most implementations struggle at this stage. If you don't go through an active process of change management, actually you can have the best tool in the world, but if people don't use it, don't see the value in it, then you really lose the impact. So for me, the most important point is really people. I mean, I know we're talking about digitization, but I think in this case, it's the human element, which is the thing that you need to be most mindful of.
I think we can all relate to getting a new tool that we did not get proper training on. So this is something I'm sure the audience can relate to as well. I got a question from the audience. Are you only able to connect Eppendorf devices to Visionize?
So we had to start somewhere. So our focus has definitely been on Eppendorf devices. So the directly connectable devices are all Eppendorf devices at this stage. We do have something called Eppendorf Visionize Sense, which is a set of probes which will allow you to incorporate other brands of incubators and freezers directly into Visionize. But we want Visionize to be one of the central tools for managing your lab in the future. And of course, this will need the connection of more devices. So as time goes on, we will definitely be working with other key suppliers to incorporate other devices directly into Visionize.
And so with Visionize and other digital platforms, are these going to be easy to implement in the lab?
I mean, there's always challenges. I think implementing a sample management system historically is always difficult. I mean, who knows what's lurking at the back of most minus 80 freezers? So there is certainly an investment in doing that. It's always easier when you don't have the historical information or historical samples to incorporate. So it's better to start early. So if you're a startup, the best time to establish your digital lab is at the beginning. However, things like a connected laboratory are actually pretty easy to implement. In our case, Visionize is cloud-based, so it's simply a matter of connecting the devices to the internet, and then you have access to the platform pretty quickly. So if you're starting from scratch, actually developing and implementing a digital app isn't that challenging. It's just if you have historical data that you need to incorporate or historical samples you need to go through, there is an investment there.
You mentioned there that the Visionize is supported by on the cloud infrastructure. Is there a reason you chose the cloud, and is it secure having that kind of connection?
So this is a discussion I've had many times over the last years. Why you'd want a cloud solution versus an on-premises solution. So there are so many benefits to having a cloud. The cloud is easy to implement, so your implementation costs are lower. It's faster to implement. From a support point of view, it's much easier for us to add new features, to put updates in, to add new functionalities to something that's based in the cloud. It's also more scalable. So connecting more devices, but also adding more functionality. The question that we always have is about security. Now, if you have your system open to the internet in any way, then even if you have something that's based on premises, there could be a small risk. Now, we chose to use the Microsoft Cloud because their security is next to is the best that we could find. We trust Microsoft to manage the security of our cloud. I think it's interesting when you talk about your professional information, when you offset that against maybe internet banking. Everyone is happy using internet banking, and that's a cloud service with all your financial information, as opposed to perhaps storing your freezer run data online. You have to look at the relative risks. So we chose the cloud because it's flexible, scalable, and easy to implement for both customers and ourselves.
It's reassuring to know that it's something that you feel you have confidence in and the security in. I have one more question relating to implementation. Can you support CFR 21 requirements?
So the eLab Next products are CFR 21 Part A compliant. The Visionize platform will have a module early next year, which will also make that CFR 21 Part A compliant system. So we'll be able to support FDA requirements as well. At this stage, Visionize can support internal compliance processes where you have your own internal audits. But we're moving towards CFR 21 Part A compliance early next year.
Wonderful. So, Steve, that was a wonderful presentation, very informative. Unless you have anything else to add, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone for joining me and have a great day. Thank you,
Thank
Matt.
you. And for everyone else, I'm so excited you were here to join us on our world premiere episode of Eppendorf Lab Channel. We are actually going to have another event on Wednesday, November 17th at 3 o'clock Central European Time, where you can see a live demonstration of the latest in Eppendorf centrifugation technology with the Centrifuge 5910RI. Learn how that particular centrifuge can help you accelerate your research. Again, that's November 17th at 3 o'clock Central European Time. This broadcast and all future broadcasts are going to be available on eppendorf.com/lab channel in the past events and on-demand sections. On behalf of the entire Eppendorf Live events team and on behalf of Steve Day, I want to thank you all for joining us and wish you a wonderful afternoon, evening, or morning.